I talked about Wii Tanks once. Remember that one? Alright, so here's the deal. We all love the Tanks game when we play, and unless you're one of those psychopaths that loves a fishing game, we all agree that Tanks is the best game on there. And if you're a Wii Tanks fan like me, that's when you realize you're boned because Nintendo clearly has no desire to revisit, let alone expand the Tanks gameplay. I mean, remember how they handled it in Clubhouse games? But fortunately, the fans have been doing what Nintendo don't, and have been creating mods and fan games aplenty. It's super inspiring stuff, and my hat goes off to all of you that keep the core Tanks gameplay alive. And since I am, you know, the Wii Tanks guy. Alright, hold your applause. It's my duty to take a look at a handful of these and let you guys know which ones you should take a look at. I've been sent so much stuff, so I do apologize if you recommended or sent me something that I don't cover today. But there is definitely enough of these to make a sequel video viable if you got something I didn't take a look at. Everything I will be talking about will be linked below, but let's get started because we have a lot of games to talk about. Hey, I'm the Wii Tanks guy, and here are the fan games I'm saying are worth your time. Starting off strong, we have Tank Quest. Tank Quest stands out from the rest of the games here because it has a larger emphasis on exploration than it does combat. Stage design is more akin to something you'd see in an adventure game opposed to something you'd see in a mission-based game. You know, what you would generally expect from top-down Tanks gameplay. That's not a bad thing at all though. In fact, I quite enjoy the change of pace. That doesn't mean this isn't still a tank game at heart, however, because the goal of each mission is still to wipe out all the enemies. The difference, of course, being that you'll have to traverse what are often huge, sprawling areas. Every stage has its own style and gimmicks too. It's got really cool puzzle-esque elements like this rotating platform you control by shooting switches, or these pushable blocks in the ice stage. You can even slam these things into the enemies to kill them. Super cool. The creativity employed here is really impressive, and it never lets up start to end. As if the variety in the stages wasn't good enough. There's a few bosses here too. Altogether, the whole package here genuinely feels like a grand adventure, which is not an easy task when making a game about tanks. A lot of that adventure feeling can be credited to its presentation. It's all the little stuff really. You got character briefing before each stage, nice squash and stretch for when you place mines, a satisfying physics engine for all the destructibles. I mean, really blowing shit up feels great. Target a pile of cones and they go flying, then you can push them around. Every stage has its own theming and music, the colors, the overall style. It's really pleasant to look at. All of the models, the characters in particular, have this low poly look to them akin to something you'd see on PS2. And honestly, I think it's kind of charming. Speaking of characters, there's a ton to choose from. Even cooler than that, however, is the method of unlocking them. There are little character heads scattered throughout the stages to pick up. Some of these guys are hidden really well too. You'll need a keen eye to locate all of them. I should also mention that all of the stages in the campaign are local co-op up to 4 players, which is a whole lot of fun. 2-player co-op is something you can expect for most tank games, but the fact this goes up to 4 is super cool. Not only that, but Tank Quest also features a deathmatch mode where you and your friends can face off in a handful of stages specifically designed for the versus mode. Both modes are great, and provide more than enough reason to grab some buds beforehand. Alright, well I slobbered over this game for long enough. Time to critique it now because I'm just a giant asshole. Compared to some other tank games, the controls aren't the tightest. Fortunately, this isn't too big of a deal since, as I said before, the focus is more on the exploration than it is the combat. But stuff like this, where my bullet got stuck on this lever, could definitely be touched up. The camera, while generally fine for the most part, I did have a few instances where I had to shoot something off screen. This bridge here on the castle level got messed up and I had to shoot a lever I couldn't even see to reset it. This game also has a sprint function, which I'm not a huge fan of, but I'll accept I'm probably in the minority of this one since a lot of games I'll be covering today seem to have something like this. But I personally think it feels a bit strange for a lot of these games to have a stamina system like you'd see in a game where you control a person. Fortunately, you can't run out of sprint in Tank Quest like you can in some other tank games. And it doesn't let you shoot while sprinting, which does provide a reason to not sprint. But speaking for myself, since there is no stamina meter equivalent, I think it'd feel more natural to have a button to toggle sprinting opposed to holding a button, at least as an option. More general suggestions would be to add a key config, and lastly some resolution settings, which seems to be a pretty taboo option for devs of these tank games. Not only do a large number of these games I'll be talking about not have window options, but I told one dev in particular it'd be a nice addition when he asked for my feedback, and he was straight up just like, nah, that's not even a joke. His exact words were, I feel people wanting exact resolutions will be outstandingly rare. Huh? I mean, really? Huh?
Resolution options killed my parents, okay? Stop bringing it up.
That being said, I wouldn't be surprised if this developer in particular were to add some of these things in future versions. Full transparency, I was sent a code for this game months ago by the developer, and I got back to him with some of my own suggestions, such as an on-screen reticle. And it would appear that between last time I talked to him and now, that was added. It does seem like the developer really cares about this project and is more than willing to listen to feedback. Overall, Tank Quest is a really solid game with a good amount of content and variety. Super creative and super fun. And $9 on Steam is not bad either. This one gets a glowing recommendation from me. But what if you're feeling super cheapo mode? I mean, $9 for this is a pretty good deal, but what if you're 12, right? You just spent the last of your mom's credit card on Fortnite, and you need a free Tanks experience. Well, that's where this next one comes in. Tiny Toy Tanks is a cut and dry Tanks game that is definitely a lot more of what you'd expect from the genre. If you've played Wii Tanks, and I know you have, it shares that same familiar structure. There's an entire gauntlet of levels split into 3 chapters, and each level sees you in a single screen room where the goal is to eliminate all the enemy tanks. You keep proceeding through the levels until you get to the final stage, or you lose all your lives. Basic, but fun. The 2 big things this game has going for it are the sharp as hell visuals, and that solid game feel. Starting with visuals, you got slick block textures and tank models, great particle effects and explosions. I particularly like the halftone effect you can see on a lot of the eye candy, not to mention the visual feedback Tiny Toy Tanks provides is very helpful. For example, they have this overheating mechanic with the lava tiles. If you overheat, you blow up. But the hotter your tank gets, the more red the corners of the screen become. This is great because it gives you an idea of how close you are to death without having to take your eyes off the action and look at the HUD. I like how the color of the bullets will change dependent on its remaining bounces. I mean, that's a really good idea. That way, if you see a new enemy type, you can tell right away what their bullets are going to do based on the color. The last bit of visual feedback I appreciate is tied to the UI. It lets you know how many more bullets you can shoot, and I think that's a good idea. Much like in Wii Tanks, you can have 5 of your bullets on the board at any given time. So if you shoot 5 times, it won't let you shoot again until your bolt hits an enemy or breaks on a wall. When things get chaotic, it can be helpful to know how many shots you have left. I think it'd work a little better if it displayed over your tank opposed to the bottom of the screen, but again, it's not a bad idea. Then the game feel is one of the best feeling of all these games. I never encountered any glitches or weird happenings, and the more precise actions such as shooting oncoming bullets is reliable. The biggest gripe I have is that this is another tank game with a dash mechanic. It doesn't let you go that fast, and it runs out in about a second. The biggest difference beyond the dash mechanic is the fact that the landmines are not proximity. In Wii Tanks, mines would explode if enemies got close, but here they do not. Otherwise, everything here is structurally sound, and it all plays pretty close to Wii Tanks. Obligatory mention that this is another game without a key config or video options. I mean, the game looks great and is simple enough that it'll likely run on even the most basic of PCs. So it's not like it needs a graphics slider or anything, but a full screen toggle would have been nice. Tiny Toy Tanks isn't exactly the most feature-rich Tanks game, but as far as free Steam games go, this is a pretty solid time. For the price tag of $0.00, I'd check it out. Another free Tanks game on Steam is Tanks the Crusades. And right off the bat, would you look at that? Window resizing and remappable inputs. Actually, holy cow, there are a lot of customization settings here. Everything from lighting options to even being able to change the camera perspective. In fact, there are so many settings here. Some of the things I was going to critique, such as the 3D ground texture being too distracting, can be toggled off of a setting. As far as the controls are concerned, it is extremely close to how Wii Tanks plays. The size of the bullets in the mines are pretty spot on, and the limit for how much can be on the screen at once is 5 for bullets and 2 for mines. Same as Wii Tanks. There's no dash mechanic either. So again, very similar to Wii Tanks. It's a bit more slidey than Wii Tanks, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a pretty competent fan game. The controls feel good, the particle effects when you destroy stuff is satisfying. Just like Tiny Toy Tanks, the HUD shows you how many remaining bullets you have, and it's overlaid on the game board too, which makes it easy to read from the corner of your eye without diverting your attention from the gameplay. There's even a cool shop feature between levels. Yeah, your tank kills are converted to points, which you can then use to buy different weapons. The weapons aren't required or anything, but it's a neat feature. But the most impressive thing about Crusades is how feature-rich it is. I mean, there's of course all those game options I mentioned, but in terms of game modes, you got 2 different campaigns with their own unique stages, a level editor so you can make your own stages, and I know how many of you love your level editors. You can have the game randomly generate stages, which is a crazy feature for a Tanks game. The only Tanks game I've played that has it, in fact. You can even play on randomly generated versus stages. Oh yeah, the game also has online play that supports every game mode I mentioned on top of the multiplayer exclusive versus mode. I think the sound design could use a little work, but beyond that, this is a very competent little Tanks game. Like I said, this is free on Steam, so check this one out if it looks interesting to you. Staying on Steam, we have Ballistic Tanks. Ballistic Tanks is a much more combat-oriented tanks game, and even its arcade mode plays much more like a wave defense game than a stage clear game. In the arcade mode, you, or you and a friend if you want to go co-op, have to survive waves of enemies in each arena, kill all the enemies of that wave, and you get a power-up like a speed or range boost. Much like in tanks, everything dies in one hit, and it's pretty straightforward since you don't have to worry about placing mines or anything. But that does not mean you only have your standard missile shot, however, because there's an assortment of other weapons that will randomly appear time to time, all of which being super satisfying to use thanks to all the awesome visual effects when killing enemies. The visual feedback for killing enemies is both this game's biggest strength and weakness, however. A lot of the effects you can turn off first of all, which is good because while I enjoyed all of it, I was playing the game with my cousin and stuff like the intense screen shake was giving him a headache, so kudos to the foresight of having an option to turn that stuff off. Regardless, what you cannot turn off is the slowdown when you kill something. To put an emphasis on the action, things will slow down or downright stop depending on what's happening on the screen. I generally think stuff like this is cool, but it's less cool in a multiplayer environment. The reason that slowdown works in a single player game is because it is often there to emphasize actions you are performing, making them more satisfying. But when you are focused on your own thing, and the game keeps slowing down due to what another player is doing, there's a bit of a disconnect there. Nothing detrimental or anything, but an option to turn the effect off would be appreciated. Then of course you have a versus mode, which is a lot of fun. Up to 4 players, and the game supports bots, which is nice. No online though, which is a bummer. Although local play is definitely the way to play a game like this. In versus, you got 3 different game modes. You got Deathmatch, which is your standard free-for-all. Then there's Power Shift, which gives each player random modifiers each round. And then Juggernaut is probably the most interesting. This mode seems like a standard free-for-all initially, with the exception of a giant octagon timer thingy happening in the center of the board. If anyone is able to hold off that position long enough without dying, they transform into a giant monster tank that shoots spread shots and has giant lasers, all of which go through walls, by the way. Of all the stuff in Ballistic Tanks, this one mode probably stood out to me the most just because of how crazy and creative the mode was. Okay, no one followed you in, right? There's one last mode, but we gotta keep it on the down low because it's not tanks. Alright, so the last mode is Airstrike. Airstrike is a free-for-all mode which also supports bots, where you fly around and try to shoot other people in airplanes. It's a lot of fun, but hey, you didn't hear this from me, alright? I'm the Wii Tanks guy, not the planes guy. All in all, Ballistic Tanks is a great time if you prefer a more versus-centric experience. The visual style is clean with great lighting effects and explosions, and controls feel responsive. Without online, I think the game would benefit from a console release to make the co-op and versus modes more accessible, but $5 is a reasonable price regardless. If you like what you see, I'd recommend this one. TANKNAROK is another game you'll want to check out if you like your deathmatch tank games. In fact, while this game is strictly just a battle-oriented tanks game, this might be the most polished tanks game I have ever played. I mean, just look at it. It's gorgeous. Incredibly vibrant color palettes, all the 3D models have flat faces with a single color tone which blends nicely with all the soft shaders. It's great stuff, and even the explosions have that really clean and polygonal look to them. But if you're not a fan of all the crazy effects, there's a lot of accessibility options. You can turn stuff like the screen shake or the bloom off if you're not a fan. This game is great though. There's such a frantic energy to every battle, and the pacing never lets up. I really can't give enough praise to the presentation here because it's doing a lot of legwork to make the game feel as chaotic as it is. The music is crazy upbeat, sounds and animations are snappy, just great stuff. You got tons of modes. Of course you got your basic free-for-all, but there's also tag, balloon battle, a pinata mode, a mode that's kind of like Mario Kart's Shine Thief where you get a crown and have to defend it until the timer runs out, a large selection of stages, and those are crazy too. Conveyor belts, rogue trains, floating laser guns, those tiles from Link to the Past that float up and then target you. This game also has my favorite implementation of a dash mechanic. For a lot of these tank games, the dash performs more like a sprint option you'd see in shooter games like mentioned before. Makes sense for human characters, not so much for tanks. In TANKNAROK, however, the dash works more like a quick dodge forward, which is more or less what it actually is. It feels really natural in a game like this, and it complements the pacing. The weapons also complement that pacing. Homing missiles, airstrikes, shotgun burst, all of the weapons are fun and satisfying. The dynamic of every battle is constantly changing since you're basically changing your loadout every few seconds. Oh, by the way, this game supports online play. Up to 4 players. Of course, you can also play offline with friends and bots. When it comes to game design, I can be a pretty nitpicky guy, but the reality is that most of the games I cover on this channel are reasonably solid. I'm generally under the belief that even our favorite games can be improved in some way, even if it's just minor stuff. And I never want to be that guy that unfairly critiques one game whilst not addressing a single hiccup with another due to nostalgia. That being said, I can't even think of a single critique I have. It's just a really well-made competitive tank game. If I had to suggest anything, it would be some single-player missions or something. But that's basically it. Full transparency, this is one of many games I was sent directly directly by the developer. However, in this case, they actually gave me some extra Steam download codes. I handed out most of them to my patrons a while back, but I still have 4 more codes I wanted to give out. So not to be that guy, but I do want to give the rest of these out, and I just figured that this would be the best way to do it. On the day I upload this, which is
September 24th.
Share this video on social media and tag me so I'll see it. And at the end of the day, I'll randomly pick 4 of you to DM a code. While there may not be single player mission modes or whatever, this is the game I'd recommend if you just want a balls to the wall battle game. And even if you aren't sent a code, the retail of $7 is a steal. The last game on Steam I'll be looking at is TANKBOX. While it may not look like Wii Tanks visually, in terms of game mechanics, this is probably the closest you'll get to playing Wii Tanks beyond just playing, well, Wii Tanks. A lot of similarities here. You get an extra life every 5 stages. If you die on a stage, it will save which tanks you've already destroyed. You got the same bullets and landmine limit, with more or less the same feeling controls. No additional controls like a dash or anything. All the different color tanks have their own corresponding instruments that get taken away from the soundtrack when defeated. Hell, remember in my Wii Tanks video when I said every stage past 20 randomly selects different layouts and tank colors? Even that is here. Like really, these guys did not miss a single detail. It's a very faithful recreation if that's what you're looking for. You got 2 different campaigns, one of which basically being a 1-to-1 recreation of the original 100 Wii Tank stages. I really can't stress enough how true to its inspiration this game is. In fact, it could practically be a replacement for it. There is new stuff too, of course. You have the brand new levels through one of the campaigns I just mentioned, unlockable hats, online support, which is nice. This is also one of the few tank games with a level editor, and those are always fun. All of my critiques sort of fall in the presentation and accessibility areas. I do want to preface those critiques by saying there was consideration put into several elements in those areas. I mean, the game certainly isn't tone deaf. For example, the original Wii Tanks plays at an angled perspective that can hide bullets or even enemies behind walls. But in TANKBOX, you have a more top-down view that prevents that issue. But if you want to play with the old perspective, that's still here too. And you can even see the bullets behind blocks via a model outline, which is something I suggested the original Wii Tanks should have had, and is appreciated. Regardless, I do think things like the destroyable blocks should have a visual representation that they are destroyable. In OG Wii Tanks, the wooden blocks that substitute as walls all have different wood stains for a bit of variety, whereas the destructible blocks are indicated with cracks, making that interactivity immediately readable. Here in TANKBOX, when I saw 2 blocks of different shades of tan, I just assumed they were the same solid object with different hues to add variety. Turns out the lighter ones are the destructible ones. It's not as if the player won't eventually figure this out while playing, but I think the more information you can relay to someone upon immediate perception, without having to resort to a
Hey, listen!
the better. Either adding cracks, or making them bricks, or maybe just making the non-destructible blocks gray so they read as concrete. Anything that can help the player immediately read the map is always appreciated. I would also suggest brightening up the color scheme a tad. The screen is sort of this big block of dark brown at the moment. It could be assumed this was done to make the tanks stand out more, but since everything has a dark outline around it, I believe it would be just as readable, if not more so, with lighter colors. To make sure I wasn't just talking out my ass, I made a quick edit to show what the board would look like with these changes, including the different block colors. And I personally believe the color adjustments could not only make things read better, but be more aesthetically appealing as well. That's just me though. Lastly, much like many of the other tank games, it'd be nice to see some video settings such as windowed mode or resolution options. There actually is a full screen toggle, but at first, I didn't think it worked. It wasn't until later I found out that the toggle does make the game go into windowed mode, but since it retains your monitor's full resolution, you can't tell that it changed unless you use a window hotkey where you hold the Windows button and press an arrow key. Then from there, you can manually adjust the window. I gotta be honest, I didn't even know about that Windows hotkey until very recently. And generally, the cool thing about options is that they allow you to make the game more accessible without doing things externally. Even if a player can do something manually, it's still nice to have built-in options and make an experience more user-friendly. Otherwise, you might as well not include controller support either because, hey, the player could always just use Joy 2 key. Trust me, I am no stranger to programming, and I understand changes like these aren't exactly tick box functions, but neither is making a game. I'm not trying to dog on this game or anything because, again, I do think it's a good game. It's extremely accurate to the source material, and I think just a few small changes could make it even better. After all, it's essentially Wii Tanks, and Wii Tanks is great. Also, quick shout out to the cool PS1 menu of the CRT. I don't know what that has to do with tanks in a box, but it's an inspired menu all the same. Although TANKBOX has the highest retail on this list, if you're looking at this and thinking, yeah, I'd pay $10 for that, then I I'd say go for it because this is a very faithful tribute to Wii Tanks. Alright, so we got a few browser-based games, so let's knock these out. I should probably start with Tank Royale since the developer actually contacted me and put fish fins in the game. Check it out, Vince, you're in a video game. Blah 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 blah. By the way, this isn't a joke. Fish fins is actually a hat you can unlock in this game. Normally you would have to pay the in-game currency to roll him, but you can type in this code at the shop and immediately get him. SilokHawk YT. It would appear that between the time it was added and the time I'm making this video, however, the sprite will gray out whenever it tries to move. It's pretty weird, but I assume it'd be an easy fix. I mean, you don't do that, do you, Vince? Blah 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 blah. Blah 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 blah. Tank Royale IO is a free-to-play browser-based game where you duke it out with other players online. You got your standard missile shot that bounces off walls, and while there is still technically mines you can place, it's now one of 9 secondaries you can select before a battle. Each and every secondary weapon is unlocked at a different level, so it's sort of similar to how online shooters handle their unlocks. It's a cool addition, but you can only use your selected secondary once per battle. This game even has destructible blocks that don't get to see much use because of the once per battle limitation of the secondary. Personally, I think it'd be cooler if each secondary had a cooldown timer. That way you can make more use of all the cool weapons. Since the player's special weapon ends up being used so early within the round, the one-on-one engagements towards the end of the round end up feeling repetitious because all you have by that point is your standard bullets. Speaking of cooldowns, there is one in place for your standard bullets. Once you shoot 3 times, the game will say reloading. This is in place of the typical bullet system you generally see in these tank games where you can't shoot if a certain number of your bullets are simultaneously out. Honestly, you could probably repurpose this timer for your special and just have it so you can only have a set number of your missiles out at once like other tank games. The game is fun though. Matchmaking is simple and intuitive. You can invite your friends to lobbies via a URL, and the coin and level systems give the game an actual feeling of progression. I don't usually expect too many options for these browser-based games, but sound settings would be nice because if you let a match drag on for too long, missiles begin to drop, and when they do, this siren sound just starts blaring. I was playing some matches with my bud Matt, and anytime that sound came on, it scared the absolute shit out of us. Tank Royale might be a bit rough around the edges, but it plays well, and it's easy to start an online game. Plus, any game with fish fins is a win in my book. Another browser game is Tiny Tanks. The weird thing about this one is that I got recommended several different games that all happen to be called Tiny Tanks. So there's a Steam game called Tiny Tanks, a user-made game on Roblox called Tiny Tanks, and then a Flash game called Tiny Tanks. I specifically got recommended the one on Roblox and the Flash game, but out of the 3, I'm gonna take a look at the one that's on Armor Games because it is the most accessible. If you think I'm gonna make a Roblox for a video, you better think again. I mean, given how many people told me that check it out, I'm sure it's good, but like, come on. You guys really gonna make me sign up for Roblox? Tiny Tanks, the one on Armor Games at least, is likely the most simplistic interpretation of Wii Tanks on this list. That's no reason to write it off, however, because I was genuinely shocked how fun this one was. As far as the similarities, you can shoot bullets that bounce off walls, you get an extra life every few stages, and each level is a self-contained room where the goal is to rid of all the enemy tanks. It plays well, controls are tight, and the art style keeps things simple but appealing. The 2 things that stood out to me about this one is that firstly, this is another tank game with bosses. It's always cool to see when a tank game features stuff like this, because what a boss should be in a mission-based tank game has so much room for interpretation. It's fun to see what people come up with, and they're fun here too. Secondly, anytime you beat a boss, you get to choose between 5 unique weapons: movement speed, an increased bullet limit, rocket upgrade, safety bullets that only kill enemies and not the player, and the best one gives you an extra hit before you die. Being able to eat 1 bullet before you lose is invaluable. You would not believe how much easier it makes the game. The snappy feedback you get from the controls, particularly killing enemies with that quick screen jolt, makes for a surprisingly engaging little tanks game. Plus, the bosses are pretty creative given the limitations of the game. I know Tiny Tanks doesn't seem like much, but I would highly recommend this one. Besides, you can literally play it in your web browser, so what do you got to lose? Continuing down the rabbit hole of tank flash games I got recommended, here's Table Tanks. I don't know if I'd really call this one a Wii Tanks inspired game, but I already played through the whole thing, so screw it. Let's talk about it. While the premise is identical to Wii Tanks, you know, single screen levels, destroy all the enemy tanks to proceed, just about everything else is dissimilar. The glaring difference here is the controls. this is the only game I'll be talking about today to use actual tank controls. In other words, up accelerates forward, down reverses, and left and right steer. Those controls can already be a pain in the ass, but to complicate things further, your aim is bound to your tank's orientation. So you know how in Wii Tanks you can move one way while shooting the other? Not possible with this control scheme. While I'm not a huge fan of these controls, initially I thought it was fine since the earlier levels play almost like a puzzle game. You have a limited number of bullets, so early on you gotta make every shot count. That being said, later in the game there are so many tanks, accuracy hardly matters, which does make this control scheme fairly questionable. It probably sounds like I'm really coming down on this game, but for what it's worth, I beat the entire thing. It is fun, but those controls can really be a handful. Similar to Tiny Tanks, Table Tanks has upgrades and bosses. The upgrades are a bit more varied, however, and it's impossible to finish the game with all of them, adding replay value. Also likewise to Tiny Tanks, this is a very fast game. Those level resets in particular are lightning fast. I mean, seriously, look at this. These might be some of the fastest resets in video game history, and infinite lives means you get to go again and again without having to worry about your performance. It's a good thing too, because the constrained controls basically result in you having to brute force your way through the later stages that just overload the room of tanks. Nothing here will wow you, but sometimes it's just nice to play a short-lived burst of entertainment. Block Tanks. This is another free online deathmatch game you can play directly from your browser, and with multiple modes to boot, like Capture the Flag, Free-for-all, and a mode called Payload where you have to secure a capture point. All shots are one-hit kill, and there's an assortment of fun weapon pickups scattered across the map. There's no limit to how many different weapons you can hold at once, and killing another player will have them drop their entire loadout, which is satisfying. You got your typical assortment of missiles and miniguns, but you can also get a hold of throwable weapons like grenades and Molotovs. Matches are easy to start or find, and they can even hold up to 32 players simultaneously. No free-to-play elements either, so everything you see is sincerely free of charge. Might seem like I'm wrapping this one up way too quickly, but there's not a whole lot to say about this one. What you see is what you get, and that's not a bad thing. The presentation is as basic as it gets, and it's fun. I played a few matches with some buds, and we all had a pretty good time, so I'd say this one is worth checking out. Alright, so we got 3 more games, all of which being non-Steam downloadable titles. Let's start with PC Plays Tanks. Ever wonder what Wii Tanks would look like if it was running on a Sega Genesis? Well, here you go. I would say NES. I mean, the title screen replicates many of the title screens seen in classic Nintendo games, but it uses too many colors per sprite to be reminiscent of NES. Plus, those explosions of all the particles look real good, and each particle has its own dynamic physics to it. This would definitely not run on an original Nintendo. On the other hand, the sound design does stay true to the limitations of the NES, or at least as far as I can tell. You get to hear 8-bit recreations of all the Wii Tank sounds, which is pretty enjoyable. So yeah, single screen rooms, defeat all the enemy tanks to proceed, 5 bullets and 2 landmine limits. It's all pretty faithful beyond the controls. The movement is a bit more clunky, likely to replicate the classic game feel. Nothing detrimental though. I got a hang of it pretty fast. I enjoyed this one though, although I do think the enemies are way too aggressive. They shoot so fast you can't land a single hit on them if you're aiming directly at them. You would think the solution would be to just shoot faster, but the game bottlenecks your rate of fire. Enemies like this you can't land a hit on would be fine for later stages, but as early as level 2, you're faced with a guy you can't even hit because it shoots at the same rate that you do. Like, come on, give me a break. The enemy behavior alone makes this play completely different from Wii Tanks, because in that game, an aggressive playstyle gave you the upper hand. Conversely, here in PC Plays Tanks, it's all about outsmarting the AI since, well, as aggressive as they are, they're not exactly the brightest. Additionally, this game has a level editor. It has all the features you'd expect, and editors are always a nice little extra. Now that we're back to games that run off your operating system, here's my obligatory suggestion for window options. This game especially needs them, however, because trying to capture footage for this one was a pain in the ass. My capture software only recognized the original resolution instead of the scaled resolution. To put it simply, the capture looked like this. I had to mess with it in OBS to get the recording you're seeing now, but people who want to stream or record aside, Windows options would be appreciated by many. This is a free download, so links below if this looks interesting to you. It's a fun one. Here's one still in development, Toy Tanks Demo version 0.8. Despite being unfinished, the graphics here are really solid. It's got a sharp, organized look to it. The presentation in general is super clean. You got a nice outline around the player tanks and the enemy bullets so they pop out more. There's a great use of color, and I really like the texturing on the wood. I know it's just wood, but hey, if your screen is gonna be 90% wooden planks, you better make that shit look great, and it does. The biggest draw to this game is the implementation of its physics engine, although I'd say it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, shooting shooting a tank and then watching it fly off is pretty amusing. Conversely, it feels like your tank is constantly flopping around, as if you don't really have any real control of it. This also leads into the jumping mechanic, because yeah, you can jump in this game. I think the jump itself is a really cool idea, but the super precise weight physics make jumping around sort of a disaster. It's kind of funny actually, so it's got that going for it. I think the physics are strange as a whole with all the slopes and curves you got going on. Like I said, they're really amusing to mess with. However, they make the actual process of navigating a tad bit unwieldy. To its credit, it definitely makes this one stand out from its peers. Plus, I played this one with my cousin, and he genuinely enjoyed the physics engine in play, so it will for sure appeal to certain players. Oh yeah, this game is 4 players by the way. I feel like I probably forgot to mention the multiplayer in some other games I've talked about today, but come on, cut me some slack. I've played like 20 different games about tanks. Alright, so here's the boring suggestion part. A key config would be nice, so you could bind the jump action to one of the shoulder buttons. It's the A button at the moment, meaning you need to take your thumb off the right stick to perform the action. I also noticed that if you pause mid-stage, it will exit you back out to the menu. Reminder that this is a demo, and I doubt that'd be a hard fix. Lastly, if the game is to implement this physics system, I'd personally suggest making the player bullets hitboxes bigger. Sometimes when I try to shoot oncoming bullets, they seem to pass right through each other. Just in general, given all the slopes, the jumping, etc., lining up a shot can be fairly tricky in this one with all the small hitboxes. Criticisms aside, Toy Tanks Demo has a lot of good ideas that make the tanks gameplay feel fresh. Jumping, water that acts like Mario 64's lava, slopes, grass that slows down your movements, and hopping turrets that shoot bombs. Although the physics here can hinder the precise nature of a tanks game, it gives this one a more playful and comedic approach to the genre. It's hard to know whether to tighten up the controls for the sake of gameplay, or leave it as is for the sake of entertainment. But whatever the dev decides to do with this one, I'm interested to see where this goes. Alright, I saved one of the best for last. This is Wii Tanks. Wait, no, not that one. Change those eyes to E's. That's the one. There's a lot to talk about with this one, so let's start by addressing the first thing you'll notice. The near identical graphical likeness to Wii Play's tanks. If you were to run Wii Play in HD, it wouldn't look too far off from this. The higher graphic fidelity allows for the destructible blocks to use this high-def cork texture, and not only does that immediately read as destructible blocks without needing cracks, but it looks great. Of course, all the tanks, the eye candy like the smoke and the explosions, all look fantastic too. A lot more cartoony than Wii Play, but it works well. As a whole, the visuals are just spot on. The soundtrack is another element that effectively replicates the original on Wii. It's got very similar instrumentation with a subtle touch of removing instruments once certain tanks are destroyed. Mechanically, the speed, the bullet hitboxes, that's all fairly close as well, with the exception of the dash mechanic. I'm not gonna dwell on it or anything since I already have several times throughout this video, although my thoughts on it here mirrors my thoughts on the whole dash mechanic element in other tank games. And yeah, not a huge fan of the whole stamina system. Running out of sprint as a tank just feels strange to me. Either way, I think adding a bar to show your remaining sprint would help out a little bit. That nitpick aside, there are tons of new ideas here I do like. Firstly, there's several difficulty settings. Quick side mention to the vocabulary of every menu containing intentional spelling mistakes. I thought that was really funny actually. Every level has its own name too, most of those being intentionally misspelled as well. Like this one, green is my favorite tea. Wait a second, green is my favorite? Okay, this guy's just mocking me by this point. On top of the multiple difficulties, you can actually continue from certain stages so you don't have to do the whole thing in one go. And I think that's a great idea. I always hear the opinion that lives are an outdated concept echoed throughout the gaming community, and I couldn't disagree with that more. Should all games have lives? No. Should a game such as Wii Play make you sit your ass down for 2 hours straight so you can play through the whole thing? No. Regardless, the value of lives is that they make you play more carefully. Once you give a player infinite lives, they are more prone to play less strategically, often opting out instead to brute force their way through every obstacle. It doesn't matter how bad you are at a game, or how dumb the strategy you're implementing is. Sooner or later, you will get lucky. That can be fun too, but does playing that way further a player's skill level for a particular game? Not really. All this to say, I think the checkpoint system Wii Tanks implements is a smart middle ground, because you still have to be conscious about how you approach each level, but at the same time you don't have to waste a bunch of hours starting from square one if you die on stage 70. This is also another Tanks game with bosses. They generally signify the last stage before a checkpoint, and as per most of these games, they're well done. I gotta say though, I was genuinely impressed with the variety in these stages. It's not always just your standard affair of walls, destructible blocks, and tanks. This This level here, for example, has trains that roll by you gotta watch out for. Or this one, where you got a dark room lit by 2 wooden lighthouses. My one critique of the level design would be the camera. Much like we play, levels with tall blocks can obscure bullets and enemies, which can result in some cheap deaths like right here. Although I did hear the developer will be addressing this in a future version, so look out for that. Quick mention that this game surprisingly doesn't have any co-op. You can turn on an AI controlled partner, which is an awesome addition and surprisingly the only tank game I've played with this feature, but no true multiplayer. That's a shame too, because this next mode, for me at least, is the showstopper and would be great with multiplayer. Motherfucking Call of Duty Zombie Tanks. This mode is so damn awesome. It's just called survival mode, but let's be real here. This is essentially COD zombies and Wii Tanks. You get points for your kills, you can spend those points on upgrades outlined in chalk on the walls, and each wave sees progressively tougher tanks. Like, it's zombies. They even have the rebuildable barricades from zombies. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense for a tank to be able to rebuild a wall, but who cares? It's fun. What a fantastic mode. Multiple maps too. They're all unlocked from you progressing through the main campaign, which provides motivation to complete it all. My favorite map is the one that's on that little road playmat that everybody had as a kid. You know the one. And to seal the deal, this is another tanks game with a level editor. Works great and is easy to use. This is a content-packed fan game, and best of all, it's free. There's so much here, it's all very well done, and I can't recommend this one enough. For sure, check it out. Ugh, jeez. This was such a big video. I can't believe how many games inspired by Wii Tanks there are. More surprising than that, however, is how good most of these are. I would say the majority of these games I covered today rival or flat out surpass the quality of the original on Wii Play. Thanks to everyone who sent these my way, and thanks to the dedicated devs that keep the genre alive. I think that'll about do it though. I'd like to give a shout out to my patrons such as Kinzo Tien, Drew Kellenberger, Naomi Norbez, David Pacheco, Benson Lucht, John Hancock, Jeffrey P. Long, Oliver Larkosh, Cashinator, Praetorian Mars, Amanda Guth, Rami Batter, and Abby Knutson. And until next time, have a good one.
Alright, cut. That's a wrap.
Thanks for your help, man.
Yeah, no problem. See you next week.
Yeah.
Hockey, that was great. I mean, not really. Your videos kind of suck ass, but you know, I watched it all.
Cool. Thanks.
So what's next?
Current, I'm going home. The video's over.
You'll be doing more Wii-related videos next, right? I love the Wii. I'll always watch your Wii videos, you know. And maybe Nintendo DS also, but that's iffy. But if you try doing videos on anything else, I'm not watching. But look at you, right? 26 and making Wii videos for a living. This has gotta be your dream job, huh? I mean, congratulations, you did it. You built a career for yourself, and now you get to make videos about Wii games until the day you die.
Is this all I am?
Huh?
Ever since high school, this was my hobby. I looked forward to doing this between work and school, but now that this is my job, it's all my life is now. I have thousands of people who have convinced themselves they love or hate me purely based on the videos I make. The irony is that the higher the view counts get, the more isolated I feel.
Yes, we're all very jealous you get to play these games all day and get thousands of views. You don't gotta rub it in. If I were in your position, I'd be one happy guy. If someone wasn't happy doing this for a living, then there's probably nothing that would make them happy ever again.
Yeah, thanks for watching.
Alright buddy, see you later.